Tranquility du Jour, March 25th, 2019. Restore and reflect while nurturing your creative spirit at a gorgeous secluded villa nestled on an Italian hilltop. Indulge in daily yoga, Tuscan cuisine, a Puccini opera, and the magic of Cinque Terre. Join me this July for Tranquility in Tuscany. Learn more at KimberlyWilson.com/Italy. Hello there, this is Kimberly Wilson, and welcome to the 448th edition of Tranquility du Jour. Today we're chatting with returning guest Danielle Dulsky, and we're discussing her latest book, The Holy Wild. So you're going to learn more about incorporating variety of spiritual practices, the 5 elements, and how to have more magic with a K in your life. Now, if you're new to Tranquility du Jour, you can find a link in the show notes at KimberlyWilson.com/448, which will give you a little bit more insight into what we're doing over here. So basically, this is a podcast featuring artists, activists, authors, all sorts of people doing amazing things, spreading inspiration in the world, and offering various tools for tranquility in the everyday. So there's also bi-weekly love notes. Sometimes they're weekly, sometimes they're every other week. And basically, little dose of inspiration to your inbox and gives you access to Tranquil Treasures, which is a plethora of MP3s, PDFs, and videos. I want to say, too, a big thank you to everyone who tuned in last night for TDJ Live, our spring edition. As always, it was a treat to be with you. I really appreciate those of you tuning in live and those of you who will be listening via the replay. It's just such a delight to welcome the new season, think about the new season, think about new tools, not rules, of course, new tools and ideas on how to find a bit more tranquility in the everyday. And a reminder that there's no one perfect way. The idea is just, how can I find tranquility when there's barking dogs, 2 dogs that are maybe having a little bit of a not getting along so well here at the Wilson household, or if there is, an inbox that's just stuffed full and projects that need to be done. Okay, that's when we need tranquility. And so that's really what Tranquility du Jour is all about. And again, I can't thank you enough for tuning in last night. It's just always such a treat. And thanks to everyone, too, who participated in the giveaway of the brand new daybook that will be coming out in May. So I'm going to announce the winner over on Instagram. You will be hearing from me shortly, the winner. And I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who posted photos from last night's event using hashtag TDJ Live. I always love seeing them. They make me so, so happy. Also, a few things that are coming up that I wanted to mention and have these added to your calendar if you're able. Pigs, Pugs, and Pinot here in Washington, D.C. That's on the 28th from 3 to 5. And then we also are doing Yoga and the Animals. So 2 Pigs and Pugs project events coming up. And this is our 4th annual Yoga and the Animals on June 8th at Burleigh Manor Animal Sanctuary. Now, the next day is TDJ Soirée, a Tranquility Masterclass that's happening here June 9th in Washington, D.C. So it's an all-day event, and it is the first day-long event that I have done in over a decade. And so it's going to be really special in the fact that there's a ton of programming. So you're going to learn ways to incorporate tranquility. You're going to be doing things. And what I mean by that, it's not like exercise sort of doing things, but sitting down, reflecting, dreaming, really kind of doing a little bit of insight work to also gain some new tools ranging from mindfulness in the everyday, creativity in the everyday, really this idea of how do we infuse our lives with more tranquility. Now, the big perks are the fact that you are going to be dining at the number 6 vegan-friendly restaurant in the world. You're also going to be spending the day there, savoring kale chips and green juice and mingling with an amazing group of women. Okay, let me just tell you, the people who have signed up already are amazing. So far, they're mainly from the DC metropolitan area and from New York, but I welcome anyone from around the world. I know we had people from Canada and the UK interested. So make a weekend of it. Come on over, because I don't know when I will be doing this again. And it has been a decade since I've done the last one. So think about this as really an immersion into an amazing experience, and all for the same price as the 4-week Tranquility Salon. So in addition to all the programming material, you get fine dining, you get a happy hour, you get a luxe goodie bag. There's all sorts of fun perks that are coming along with this event. So I hope to see you there. And again, tickets are general admission and VIP, which gives you a plethora of many, many other perks. And there is a limited amount of seating, and it's going to be an intimate experience. So I hope you're as excited about the event as I am. It's really the last thing that I'll be offering, or that I have planned for 2019, other than a fall Tranquility Salon. And then, of course, Tranquility in Tuscany. So if you are available and interested in jet setting off to Tuscany to join me for this retreat, this will be my last Italy retreat for a couple of years. We have 4 spots left. And it's just a phenomenal experience in the fact that we dive into yoga, creativity, and mindfulness every single day. And we have a day trip to Cinque Terre, which, Google it. It is like one of the most magnificent places in the world. No big deal. And then also save the date for our next free online gathering, which is TDJ Live on June 23rd. Danielle Dulsky. So she says, my work is rooted in what I still stubbornly choose to call the wild feminine, or the aspects of the human psyche which I believe are the most socially denigrated. These are our connection to the natural world, our right to feel and be sensuous, our knowledge of holistic relationship and the spiral dance of time, our psychic power and intuitive wisdom, and our body-spirit union. I translate the wild feminine into writing, multimedia art, teaching, motherhood, and witchcraft. But I aim to have my core message constant. It is our birthright to resurrect embodied spirituality, a unique holiness that is lived out and experienced in the body through the senses and made manifest in ritual, story, and magick-making. I'm the author of Woman Most Wild and The Holy Wild, a pagan poet and heathen storyteller, a Celtic freestyle witch, and I long for the mists. May we all find what we seek, hag spirits that we are. Welcome, Danielle.
Thank you, Kimberly. Very happy to be here.
Congratulations on your new book, The Holy Wild, a Heathen Bible for the Untamed Woman.
Thank you.
So it's a mouthful. I love it. Tell us about the title and kind of where you came up with this, and if it's a sequel to the last fabulous book that you wrote.
So not a sequel. The title's really good, right?
It is.
I came up with the title actually first and then kind of built the book around the title. So it is a book that is kind of an ode, a 5-part ode to the elements and how to work with the elements. So meaning earth, water, fire, air, and ether, how to work with those in your own personal spiritual practice, how to use them to kind of frame your unique story and experience, and how to kind of hand make these small everyday rituals or these forms of practical magic that can serve pretty much anyone and are very accessible, I think, for most people. So it's kind of a little bit more in depth than the first book, which was Woman Most Wild, which was about these 3 keys to liberating the witch within. The Holy Wild is more about linking whatever your spiritual practice is, not only to nature, but also to your unique experience and story and voice.
Gotcha. And so do you feel like it's helpful for listeners to have read Woman Most Wild or to be a little bit familiar with that? Because, you use words like magic and witch and, whether or not people would necessarily understand that.
Yeah, I think, it's normal, I guess, in our society to have kind of a visceral reaction to the words, words like witch or pagan or heathen. So yeah, I think that, if you're somebody that kind of is still a little bit fearful of those words, that maybe reading the first book would be helpful. But even just kind of looking at why you have those visceral reactions to those words like magic or witch. If you go back just a little bit, usually you can figure out that's not your belief that those words are bad. It comes from somebody from childhood or a fairy tale or something like that.
Right. And so just for any listener who maybe didn't hear your first podcast, can you do just a little definition of what you mean by witch and magic with a K?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, I'll say that any witch would give you a different answer to that question. So in my opinion, what a witch is, or who a witch is just anyone who, first of all, practices witchcraft, which means different things to different people, but practices witchcraft and then has also claimed the name witch for themselves rather than have, been given the name witch, that you've really claimed it for yourself. And then magic for me is the conversation that we have with the world about the kind of world that we want the children of the future to live in. So it might be spellcraft. It might be ritual, it might be ceremony, but whatever it is the practitioner's way of saying, this is the kind of world that I hope the children of the future will live in. These are the values that mean a lot to me, and that I think would serve the world at large.
And you use witchcraft, and I'm curious how you would best define that for someone who does or doesn't identify maybe as a witch, right? As to what would witchcraft look like in everyday life?
Yeah. So again, that's another word that any witch would define differently, but I think it's important to know that witchcraft is a craft. It's an art. So it is, Starhawk, who's one of the more famous witches, she says that ours is always a practice of poetry and not theology. And I just think that's a beautiful way of putting it. So, it's an art that can be learned. It is a skill. It doesn't have to be scary. And it's almost always, it's a way of connecting the practitioner to nature, whether that's the elements or it's the solar and lunar cycles, but it's a way of connecting body, emotions, sensuality, all of those things that we tend to think of as maybe more divorced from spiritual practice, as putting those right, like smack in the middle of what our ritual and ceremonies should be and are.
Yeah, it almost sounds a little bit like ritual.
Yes, right, exactly.
Now, you have, as you mentioned, the book defined into these 5 elements, right? So we have, as you mentioned, we've got earth, water, fire, ether, and air. And can we walk through kind of each of these and then just maybe share kind of maybe one of your favorite pieces about it, or, because I love seeing things broken out like this. And first of all, I love that you created the book around the title. It's so funny, right? When that happens, you're like, this title is happening. Now what's going to go into it? I don't know, but the title is happening. And so I love, the way you built this in. But yeah, can you talk a little bit about, maybe we'll start with earth, if that works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'll start by saying that the elements are kind of the lens through which I see the world. So even though I did start with the title and build the book around the title, the elements are always just a very kind of accessible way of organizing, not only writing, but organizing everything for me. So, and any philosophy I can kind of see in relationship to the 5 elements. So earth is is our ground. Earth is our foundation. So it's very much kind of like the primal aspect of ourselves and our magic. It is connecting to the physical earth, like mud or clay or trees or something like that. But it's also a little bit like primal. It's our survival. It's our flesh. It's akin to the maiden archetype, and she's very sensual and instinctual and maybe even a little bit reactive and youthful in that way. So earth to me is very fundamental and the place from which we begin. And then water is very sensual and a little bit more fluid and a little bit less predictable than earth is. So the archetype that I work with in the Book of Water is this idea of the free dancing, or the brave-hearted artist is what I call her. So very artistic and very in touch with sensuality and emotions, and not really worried about being called wild or immature. And then the Book of Fire is our activism. It is our will and our ferocity. So that's where we get in touch with the mother archetype, and she's very generative and kind of protective and maybe a little bit angry and also very strong voiced. So the fire chapters are, the language in the fire chapters, I think, changes a bit and becomes a little bit more ferocious, and necessarily so, because that's the magic that is going to change the world. That's the kind of darker face of goddess, and she is the destructor. She's the breakdown. And then there's kind of a big leap from fire to air. The Book of Air is very relational. So still actually the mother archetype, but her other face, which is kind of soft and light and very concerned with the global community and holistic healing and relationship. And then when we get to the Book of Ether, Ether's less tangible and therefore more difficult to describe. But it's the element that's kind of like in the ethers. So it's where the ghosts are and the spirit guides and the angels. And so it's working with the mystery, meaning, owning that part of our spirituality that's okay with not knowing everything and not having a pretty little box in which to put everything and every experience. So all five of those elements are very interdependent on one another.
And what are some of the rituals that would fall under each of these? Like starting with Earth, some of your, maybe one that would be most accessible to our listeners.
Well, I don't know if, I guess it's the most accessible. The one that I like the best in the Earth chapters is the ritual of the forbidden fruit. And I forget exactly what I call it, but I think it's the first ritual that's in the Earth rituals chapter. And it's like taking an apple or some piece of fruit that's kind of carvable and a skewer or a knife or something. And just, on that fruit, just writing all of these words that might represent experiences that you've had that have been forbidden, that have been like that, born of that rebel part of your psyche, and that might have been called shameful or sinful. So kind of writing these words or even symbols that represent those experiences on the apple and then eating it and owning every part of that experience as necessary for your becoming.
And another ritual that falls under this is the two-wed sacred solitude, a soul marriage ritual for the too much woman. And I think that so many people can relate to this, right? Particularly in this era of feeling like, oh, you're too much. You're too vocal. And so can you tell us a little bit about that ritual?
Yeah, it's very much like a marriage ceremony, except you are wedding yourself. So there's vows that are spoken in the ceremony of, you're not necessarily saying I'm going to be alone forever or even that you're alone right now. You're just saying that sacred solitude is one of your core values and that you are maybe more authentic and genuine when you're on your own in certain situations. And there's a container for that I think is kind of not as socially acceptable acceptable as what a traditional marriage might be between two people, right? So this is kind of committing to soul. It's a commitment ceremony to soul.
And what about a water ritual, right? Water is so cleansing. And you know how I love that back in the day, how they even thought that water could cure mental illness. I mean, I kind of think like it definitely helps our mental health. But I'm curious, under a water ritual, what's one that maybe some of our listeners could practice?
Yeah. Again, the one that comes to mind, and I don't actually have the book in front of me, or I could be more specific about it, but the one that comes to mind is a group ritual that's kind of like a baptism. And it can certainly be done without other women, but in the book, it's described as being this group ritual where there's this combination of speaking your story. So, your story that might be, your sexual evolution or sensual. So speaking your story in circle, and then kind of having this wild dance where you dance your story. And then in the end, you baptize yourself in the name of the holy sensual or the holy wild. And I think that, what you're talking about, how these water rituals are just apparent in every spiritual tradition, and that baptism is such a beautiful practice that I always tell all of my students that, spring is the time for baptism, that we can all just go underwater and rise again, reborn into a different version of ourselves. It's interesting because autumn in the Celtic, in the Celtic wheel of the year is west, which is the direction of water. And that comes from, when they would look west in Ireland, that was the mystery. That was the ocean versus, living on the East Coast where I do now. If I look west, it's just, more land or mountains. But so west is water. And so autumn is water in the Celtic wheel of the year. So it is this direction of mystery and death and the letting go. So rituals that are really healing at this time are working with ancestral magic and working with, honoring your ancestors, or maybe not even your ancestors, but loved ones who have passed over. Being able to talk about death and be okay with it, and to talk about grief and know that grief is very cyclical and very much a part of our worlds rather than kind of shunning it. So I'm just thinking of like these gray waters being very mysterious and kind of covering over all of these things that aren't quite known yet, but still very much a part of the world.
One of the pieces as we move into fire ritual that stands out, particularly kind of coming off the heels of the Kavanaugh hearings, is this Rage is Ours, a communal ritual of glorious validation. So, living in Washington, D.C., there was a lot of rage, right? And many people coming to D.C. to express said rage. And so I'm curious, for you, if there's anything in fire ritual that you think could be helpful for women who are really kind of struggling right now with the way things are going.
That ritual that you're talking about, that being able to, voice your rage and having a circle of women that are seeing that, I actually did that, kind of liminal week between, they weren't sure whether they were going to approve him finally, and it looked like maybe it was going to be okay. And so I was leading this week-long immersion at that time, and we did that rage release ritual, and I don't know that it released anything, because again, it was like this time of like waiting to hear, but it is so potent to be able to be a woman among other women, and so one woman would go into the circle and all of the other women are chanting, "I hear you," or "You are heard." And she just kind of rattles off all of the reasons why she's angry. And there's these waves of kind of it being a little bit funny, maybe even. And then it gets very, very dark very quickly. And all of these other women are saying, "I hear you, I hear you." And maybe even mirroring what her movements are. And then, it goes on until all of the women have done that. And it is such a unique experience to not only be able to say why you're angry and to have that be okay, not only okay, but held in this container. But then to be able to be like seen and really validated by other women who are kind of angry about the same things that you're angry about. That's a very powerful thing. So I do, I know that the political climate is so volatile right now. And those fire verses, I had written those. I mean, now it's been more than a year and I read them now and I'm like, oh my God, these are more applicable now than they were then, from my own voice. They seem just as applicable now as they were when I wrote them.
Yeah. Agree. Yeah, I think we're definitely in a very fiery time. And then air rituals, right? Is there one that kind of stands out there for you that might be good to describe?
The one that I can think of just off the top of my head, I believe it's in the air rituals chapter, is this idea of rescuing the mother's twin. And what I had talked about in the book is, there's kind of like the two faces of the mother, which are kind of like the two faces of the goddess. So there's kind of this more light and most people feel palatable and acceptable version of goddess. And then there's her fiercer, more destructive face, right? So the mother's twin, it isn't the archetype of the mother that's very nurturing and, like long-armed and constantly doing things for other people. It's her fiercer face, her more ferocious face. So rescuing the mother's twin is being able to own those kind of darker and louder and more willful aspects of the mother, and being able to do that in a ceremony. It's a symbolic action. So it seems, especially solitary rituals sometimes can seem is this really important? And it absolutely is, because it causes these kind of major, sometimes psychic shifts where we move from maybe conceiving of the mother as this one way where she's kind of fluffy and exhausted, maybe, and then being able to conceive of her as being the one who decides what needs to go, being very discerning and again, kind of like her darker face, her more destructive face. So that's the ritual that for now, even though it is air, which is a more lighthearted book than the Book of Fire, that is the one that I think is most potent for this time right now, being able to rescue the mother's twin and own that part of the feminine psyche that is destructive and scary and fearsome, because that's what we need right now.
Is that kind of equivalent to one's shadow side?
It can be. It can be. I mean, your shadow is, but you have a sinister shadow, and then you have a kind of a lighter shadow. Bill Plotkin calls it the golden shadow. But our sinister shadow, it's anything that you would swear you weren't, right? So if you're a woman and you would swear that you aren't a witch, you aren't a hag, you have none of this kind of angry, destructive, long-tongued part of your psyche, that you have none of that. It's your shadow, because you absolutely do. It's just that you decided you didn't during childhood. You decided that was bad during childhood, and very much out of necessity, because we had no social supports, to tell us that we could have that kind of fiercer, bossier, more destructive side. So it absolutely is a lot of women's, but also men's shadows. But, being able to harvest it and own it, and you're able to access, these huge resources, these immense resources that you don't have, when you're living with that integrated shadow.
One of the things too, one of the words you just used that I was going to ask about, and then we can circle back to ether rituals, but is the word hag and crone. I don't know. For some reason, I always kind of thought those were synonymous, but it sounds like you're kind of breaking them out as two different terms. Is that correct?
No, not really. I kind of use them interchangeably. I guess, hag is a word that's maybe less played out than crone. And so if we're looking at, really being able to strike at those parts of the dark feminine that are a little bit more scary, then hag is appropriate, right? Because, hag is like, gives everybody that kind of reaction, like, oh, what is that? So yeah, so just they both mean kind of the elder, intuitive feminine.
Gotcha. Okay, perfect. And then let's talk ether rituals. I never fully grasp what ether is.
Yeah, that's it, right? Because it is ungraspable.
Okay. So it's not just me.
Not just you. Ether is space. Right. So it's the space in between all of the elements. Ether to me, and in my personal practice, is kind of the unseen where the subtle energies vibrate. So for those that are kind of training themselves to see auras or to be able to see these subtle energies, the ether is kind of where it is. You have to kind of let your focus go, and stop looking at the really hard-edged and heavy material and look into the space for these more subtle energies. And I know all of that sounds kind of weird, but that's where the ether is. So ether rituals, there's a wide range in the book of ether rituals. The ones that I like the best, I think, are the ones that work with this idea of authentic death ritual, like death ritual that really honors what has died, whether it's a person or in the book, a lot of times it's just, what are you laying to rest right now in your life? It could be an indoctrinated belief that no longer serves you, or it could be a relationship, or it could be a practice that, maybe did serve you very well last year, but now it is time for it to go. So being able to kind of grieve these things that are dying in a healthy and authentic way, and to give them almost a funeral, and speak their eulogies and be able to offer yourself closure, instead of just kind of rushing past that part, because any magic that the magic of this time of year is banishing magic or purging magic, or what are we releasing? And there's a tendency, I think, for even witches to do that and kind of call it good and done without allowing themselves that necessary grief. And if you're releasing a belief that you've had for years and years, of course, there's going to be a grieving process that happens. So ether rituals really help with heart healing.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, it's nice to kind of go through these different elements and see like, okay, well, how do we apply these? And one of the pieces I mentioned earlier, and I just wanted to circle back on, is that using magic with a K. Can you explain a little bit about that and the why?
Yeah, it's actually a very simple answer. So it's magic with a K. It was, I believe, Gerald Gardner who began doing that relatively recently in the 20th century, just adding the K in order to distinguish between the magic that witches do, the witches practice, and magic that a magician might do, which would be more like illusion or trickery. So adding the K is just a way of distinguishing between, what the magic that witches practice in ceremony, ritual, and spellcraft, and then the magic that, Penn and Teller might do.
Gotcha. Okay, perfect. That's helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And so for our listeners, what would you say is kind of like maybe your number one advice, or your, the thing that you find is most helpful for newbies, kind of new to this practice or experience, is how to best engage their own inner witch?
Yeah, I hope this isn't the same answer that I gave for Woman Most Wild, because it is my go-to advice. But what I always say is that you need to look back through your life experience to those moments when you have felt the most you, and those moments when you were in nature, when you really felt like, this is it. And these are fleeting moments. These aren't like long periods of time when you were happy or when you went on an epic vacation or something like that. These are fleeting moments in time, these memories of feeling just completely whole and kind of, in this perfect place, as if like your soul had scripted did this moment in your life? And, what elements were present at that moment? Were you watching the sunset? Well, that's fire. Were you gardening? Well, that's earth. Were you swimming? That would be water, right? So looking at these fleeting moments in time when you really felt held by Gaia, by the Earth Mother, and looking at what those patterns were. And not only the elements, but were you always creating something? Were you always moving? Were you always alone, or were you always with other people? And these moments are very much unique to you. And they're kind of the building blocks for what your witchcraft will be. And if you don't want to call it witchcraft, that's fine. Your building blocks for what your spiritual practice will be. And then that way your practice becomes that much more authentic and isn't just something that you've read in a book and have kind of copied. So, and that's what keeps you doing it. That's what makes it yours and not anyone else's.
You know what I love about that, Danielle, is from a psychology perspective, whenever we're working to kind of retrain our thoughts or like get rid of that one negative recurring thought that's always on a loop is, we work with thought replacing. And then one of the things is like, okay, bring yourself back to a moment where it was just like idyllic and kind of picture yourself in that. And so I love this because it kind of ties into that. Like say you were gardening with your grandmother as a child, right? So it's like, okay, reconnecting with this earth element and all that means.
Mm-hmm. Yes, right. Exactly. And you said grandmother, like the other thing is that I tried to express in the book is that, our craft kind of runs in our blood. It is ancestral. And so, those moments that you've had, whether it was gardening or watching the sun or campfire or whatever, someone back through your line, whether it was your mother line or your father line, somebody had moments like that. And I always think that that's such a powerful thought, that you are kind of this co-creation, this masterpiece that's been born of all of these different moments that are just very much in your blood that, you didn't experience in this life, maybe in quite the same way, but somebody did if you go back far enough.
Beautiful. Thank you. I love that. I love that kind of blending of familial and ancestral and all of this. My last question for you, Danielle, which is a question I always ask my beautiful guests that ties into the show, right? The name Tranquility du Jour. So I'm curious for you, as a writer, as a teacher, as everything you kind of had going on, how do you find tranquility in your everyday?
Yeah, I'm afraid it's a boring answer, but my tranquility is always, I have a very specific place that's near to my house where I walk, sometimes with the dog, sometimes with my fiance, sometimes totally alone. But it is this wild kind of weird place where I feel, I don't bring my phone with me and I feel just very, kind of safe, almost in a way that like I don't really feel even at home sometimes. I live in a kind of built environment, so to be able to go for a walk and go to this place, that's my tranquility. There's vultures that fly overhead, and I know vultures aren't very tranquil for a lot of people, but they are for me. And there's these wild junipers that grow, and it's just a really beautiful magic place.
Beautiful, Danielle. Well, thank you so much for being back on Tranquility du Jour. It's always a treat to have you.
Anytime. Thank you, Kimberly.
A question for you. Last thing. Do you have another book on the radar or in the plans?
Not yet.
Okay.
But to be continued.
Okay. Well, when you do, we will hear you again here on Tranquility du Jour. Thank you, Danielle.
Yes. Thank you, Kimberly.
So you can find Danielle at danielledulsky.com, on Facebook at Wolf Woman Circle, on Instagram at Wolf Woman Witch, and on Twitter at Wolf Woman Witch. So there's also in the show notes a link to the TDJ Live Spring replay, and then also a link to my first podcast with Danielle, where we talked about her first book, Woman Most Wild. And also a reminder of Year of Tranquility, my sixth book that released in January, comes with 5 bonuses. There's a link to that in the show notes. It's KimberlyWilson.com/YOT. Also, you can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and of course, YouTube. And anyone interested in shopping seasonless, vegan, locally made, eco-friendly fashion, I have a clothing line called Tranquility that I've been designing since 2002. The spring collection is out and it's adorable, maybe my favorite yet. There's also a link to browse my 6 books. Reminder that there will be a new daybook coming out in May, and I have a link to that over on the blog, and I also have it in the show notes for you. And then, of course, there is the iPhone app and the Android app for the Tranquility du Jour podcast, and read about my passion for animals because I'm slightly obsessed with pigs and pugs, and you will always probably hear some pugs snoring and moving about in the background of the podcast. And then finally, if you have a moment to pen a review on iTunes of Tranquility du Jour and or share this podcast via social media, would love it. Always appreciate more tranquility getting out into the world. And if you have a moment to review any of my books on Amazon or Goodreads, would be most grateful. In the interim, I wish you a delightful week ahead. I look forward to connecting further online and hopefully in person at one of our upcoming events. Wishing you a great, great day. Thanks for tuning in. Namaste.